Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to, well, really get under the skin of complex ideas, break them down, and hopefully make them stick. Today, we're tackling a question that feels fundamental to democracy, but honestly, it's often just glossed over. How can citizens actually hold their leaders accountable if they don't grasp the basics? Like how the government gets its money, how it works, what public resources even are.
Exactly. Really goes to the heart of it.
It does. It challenges what we think makes democracy, well, work.
And that's our mission today. We're going to unpack how sometimes the systems that are supposed to empower people can actually, maybe even deliberately, undermine their ability to participate in an informed way. Our main source is a really thought-provoking piece by Christian Lisangola, The Democratic Illusion, When Failing Education Weakens the Voice of the People. It came out in November 2024. Now, a lot of his focus is on the African context, but you'll see pretty quickly, I think, how relevant these insights are, well, everywhere, universally, really.
Okay, so let's dive in. Where do we start? Lee Singola has this anecdote, doesn't he?
He does. It's quite something. It perfectly sets the scene for this crisis of civic understanding he's talking about.
Right, the social media story. Tell us about that.
So picture this. There's a big scandal in his country. A top official, caught red-handed basically, embezzling a huge amount of public money. Lee Sengola, like most of us probably would, goes online and expresses his anger.
Well,
This is public trust being betrayed. It's theft from everyone.
it's like a pretty normal reaction, outrage.
Totally. But then the response he gets from another user is just staggering.
Oh, okay.
The user doesn't agree. They accuse Lee Sengola of jealousy.
Jealousy. Not outrage about the theft, but envy.
Exactly. That Lee Sengola was just mad because the politician was rich and powerful, not because public funds were stolen. That initial reaction itself says a lot, right? About maybe how people perceive wealth and power versus public office.
Wow. Yeah, that's already quite a disconnect. But it didn't stop there, did it?
No, it got worse. Lee Sengola tried to explain, patiently, look, this money that was stolen, it comes from taxes. It's your money, it's my money, it funds our communities.
The basics of public finance.
Right. And the user's response, it showed this gaping chasm, as Lee Sengola puts it. The person literally said, are you crazy? What money could I possibly use to pay this person?
Unbelievable. The whole idea that citizens fund the state was just alien.
Completely foreign. And even after Lee Sengola laid it all out, how taxes work, how they fund services, the whole mechanism, the user just doubled down, called him a liar.
Just a flat refusal to accept
A
it?
categorical refusal, yeah. And Lee Sengola stresses, this isn't just some random internet argument. It's a symptom, a really stark example of a deep systemic problem in civic understanding, a fundamental break between people and the state they live in.
So what are the implications of that if people don't even grasp that they fund the state?
Well, that's the core question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
How can you possibly hold leaders accountable? How can you demand transparency? How do you even see corruption for what it is if you don't get that basic concept that your taxes, your money funds the state? The whole idea of accountability just evaporates.
Right, because if it's not your money being stolen, in your mind,
Then it's just some rich person's problem. Or maybe they were just clever enough to get it. The idea that officials are stewards of collective resources, resources belonging to the people, it just doesn't compute.
that lack of basic financial literacy about the state, it creates a vacuum.
Exactly. A vacuum where responsibility just disappears.
That's already deeply concerning. But Lee Sengola argues this isn't just confined to sort of ordinary citizens.
No, and this is where it gets even more alarming, really. He says this lack of understanding goes right into the state apparatus itself.
You mean like the police, the military?
Precisely. He observes that security forces themselves, police and military, often fail to realize they are paid with taxpayer money. They don't make that connection.
Wow, okay, so what does that lead to?
He links it directly to what he calls their chronic lack of respect towards citizens and their sense of non-accountability to the population.
It creates this bizarre paradox, doesn't it?
A really dangerous one. The very people who are supposed to protect citizens, paid by those citizens, often end up acting like, well, like predators, as he puts it.
Even though their salary, their uniform, everything comes from the people they're mistreating.
Exactly. Because they don't understand that link. The sense of public service, of being accountable to the public, it's just not there. It gets replaced by, what? Entitlement. Power without responsibility.
It completely breaks the social contract.
Fundamentally.
So for you listening, this isn't just about some far-off place. It really makes you think about the basics, doesn't it? The trust and the knowledge needed for any society to function justly. how does civic literacy, or the lack of it, play out in your own community? Have you seen situations where basic ideas about government or public service are just misunderstood? It's got universal implications, for sure.
And Lisangola argues this situation, this widespread lack of understanding, isn't an accident. He frames it as something much more calculated.
Okay, how so?
He says it's not the result of chance, but the outcome of a deliberate strategy to maintain ignorance. That's a heavy claim.
Deliberate.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's unsettling. How does he support that?
He brings in Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, pedagogy of the oppressed.
Right, the critique of education as just banking information, not fostering critical thought.
Exactly. Freire talked about how systems can cultivate ignorance to maintain control. Lisangola applies that analysis of the systematic cultivation of ignorance directly to the contemporary African context. He argues it takes particularly insidious and sophisticated forms, and even sees a disturbing continuity with old colonial practices. The methods might change, but the goal, maybe not so much.
So, maintaining ignorance through what? How does it manifest?
He points squarely at the education system itself, arguing it's deliberately maintained in a state of chronic decay.
Not just underfunded, but deliberately decayed.
That's his argument. Not just neglect, but a strategic choice. And the result, what he calls a façade democracy.
A façade democracy, meaning?
Meaning all the forms are there, elections, parliaments, courts, but without the substance. The rituals happen, but the meaning, the understanding, the real engagement from the people, it's missing.
Like going through the motions.
Precisely. It's like having the set dressing for democracy, but no one really understands the play.
And this connects to other thinkers, too.
Yes. He draws a strong parallel to Frantz Fanon. Fanon wrote extensively about how after colonialism formally ended, the mechanisms of control didn't necessarily disappear.
They just changed hands sometimes.
Right. Fanon talked about how old power structures are replaced by new forms of social control, more subtle but equally effective. The new post-colonial elite, in some cases, just adapted the old tools.
So the political elite using modified colonial techniques as modern social control tools, that's a chilling thought.
It is. And Lisangola says this strategy works through a kind of double manipulation.
Okay, what's the first part?
First, the systematic destruction of educational structures that could allow the emergence of critical consciousness. So, undermining quality, curriculum, teachers, infrastructure, making sure the foundation for independent thought just isn't there.
And the second?
Perhaps even more insidious, the promotion of a culture of ignorance where the capacity for questioning is systematically discouraged, even ridiculed.
So it's not just not knowing, it's being actively discouraged from wanting to know or from asking tough questions.
Exactly. Imagine a place where asking why is seen as naive or troublesome or even dangerous, where skepticism is frowned upon.
And the result of that culture?
It leads to what he calls collective self-censorship. It's perverse. People internalize the idea that ignorance is normal, maybe even safer or better.
So they stop questioning themselves.
They stop questioning. They consider ignorance the default. It becomes uncomfortable, maybe even socially risky to challenge things. So people censor themselves, making it easier for those in power to maintain control without constant, overt force. The facade democracy feels normal.
It really makes you pause and think. In our own lives, in our media, are there subtle ways critical thinking gets discouraged? Maybe dissent gets framed negatively. It might not be a state collapsing schools, but yeah, subtle pressures exist everywhere.
Absolutely. It's always worth examining those dynamics.
Okay, so let's shift gears slightly. Lisangola brings up voting, specifically the voting age, as another example of this distortion.
Yes, another really striking example. The idea that 18 is the standard voting age is almost universal.
And the assumption is at 18, you're mature enough, you have the discernment for informed participation.
Right, that's the theory. And Lisangola points out, historically, in many Western democracies, 18 lined up with finishing secondary school.
Where you'd presumably learned about government, civics, history, developed critical thinking skill.
Exactly. There was this idea of a structured, progressive educational edifice. Civic education was central. You're supposed to graduate not just with knowledge, but with the tools to analyze issues. The age wasn't arbitrary. It marked the end of that preparation.
Okay, so that's the ideal. What's the contrast Lisangola draws?
The contrast is stark. He asks, what does 18 really mean in places where civic education is practically non-existent, where school programs just skip it, or where basic education itself isn't even accessible to everyone?
If that educational foundation isn't there,
then the voting age just becomes a meaningless legal fiction. It's a formality, it checks a box, but it doesn't guarantee any real capacity for informed choice. The number is there, but the substance behind it, it's missing.
Which leads to, well, real-world consequences. He has that election story, right?
Yes, the 2011 election anecdote, it's incredibly telling. He describes watching a man get elected as a deputy, a legislator.
With no political background.
None whatsoever. No known civic engagement, no experience.
So how did he win?
His strategy was, as Lisingola says, simple and effective. A few months before the election, he used his personal fortune to electrify an entire neighborhood that had been without power for years.
Wow. Okay, so a big, visible act of generosity.
Exactly. Bringing light, literally. But Lisingola argues this reveals a fundamental and tragic misunderstanding of what a deputy is supposed to do, both by the candidate and the voters.
Because the candidate had no platform, no vision.
Right. No history of public service, no policy ideas, no ideals he was fighting for. He just magically appeared as this opportunistic benefactor, using his wealth to essentially buy goodwill and votes.
It wasn't about systemic change, just a personal favor.
Precisely. And the voters, lacking that civic education. How could they know better, really? They didn't grasp that a deputy's job isn't to be a personal ATM or a local philanthropist.
Their job is representation, legislation, policy, systemic stuff.
Exactly. Representing interests in parliament, influencing policy, fighting for reforms that benefit everyone long term. This fundamental confusion between personal generosity and public function, Lisingola argues, is incredibly dangerous. It turns democracy into a transaction.
And that creates a cycle, doesn't it?
A deeply perverse one. Because that representative, elected purely on personal handouts, has zero incentive to educate his voters.
Why would he, if they were more educated?
They'd see through it. They'd demand real representation, accountability for taxes, policy debates, not just flashy gestures.
So the system reinforces itself. Keep people uninformed and you can keep buying votes with favors.
Exactly. The political class maintains low education levels to hold on to power. Democracy becomes this tragic farce, as he calls it, where votes are essentially bought.
That anecdote, it really makes you think, are there echoes of that in our own politics? Times when maybe a big, visible, short-term handout overshadows the need for actual policy scrutiny or systemic change? It's a pattern worth watching for.
Definitely. And Lisingola argues these kinds of dynamics are propped up by what he calls a double illusion, at the heart of how many democracies function, or rather malfunction.
A double illusion serving the elite. Okay, what's the first part?
The first illusion is the widespread belief, internationally and domestically, that just holding elections, even if they're technically clean, free, transparent, is enough to guarantee a working democracy.
But isn't that the cornerstone? Free and fair elections.
They're necessary, absolutely. But Lisingola critiques how international observers, for example, often just focus on the technical stuff.
Like, was the voting orderly? No violence? Correct procedures followed?
Right. They tick those boxes.
No.
But they completely ignore the qualitative dimension. They don't ask, did the voters actually understand the issues? Do they know what the people they're electing are supposed to do?
So focusing on the mechanics, but ignoring the meaning.
Exactly. It's like checking if a car's engine turns over, without asking if the driver knows how to steer or where they're going. The form is perfect, but the substance, the informed participation, is missing.
Okay, that's the first illusion. What's the second?
The second, which we've touched on, is the belief that age automatically confers the capacity for political discernment, regardless of education level and understanding of civic issues. Just being 18 makes you ready, supposedly.
And these two illusions together, they benefit the elites.
Perfectly, Lisingola argues. They create this veneer of legitimacy. See, we have elections, adults are voting, while allowing the underlying manipulation through ignorance to continue.
How does that manipulation work on a deeper level?
He brings in Pierre Bourdieu here, the sociologist. Bourdieu talked about symbolic domination or symbolic violence.
Not physical force, but subtler.
Much subtler. It's how power structures maintain themselves, by shaping how people think, what they see as normal or natural, often through institutions like education or media.
So if the system teaches you, subtly or overtly, that politics is not for you, or that questioning is pointless.
That's symbolic violence. You internalize it. And this leads to what Bourdieu called the unconscious complicity of the dominated. People aren't necessarily choosing ignorance, but the system makes it the path of least resistance. They lack the tools to even see how they're being disempowered.
Complicity without realizing it, that's
Right.
quite a concept.
It is. And Lisangola connects this to the work of the Cameroonian philosopher Fabien Ebousi Boulaga. Back in the 70s, Boulaga saw this dangerous split in post-colonial African education.
A split? How so?
On one hand, Boulaga described this elitist education, often in top schools, maybe even abroad. It produces leaders who are brilliant at manipulating the language of governance, policy, international relations.
They sound the part.
Absolutely. Fluent in sophisticated concepts. But, Boulaga argued, they're often totally disconnected from local realities and the real needs of their fellow citizens. Trained in Western universities, maybe, but without a real grasp or even interest in the day-to-day struggles back home.
Okay, that's one extreme. What's the other?
The other is a chronically underfunded mass education, deliberately maintained at such a basic level that it prevents the development of true civic consciousness. Basic literacy, maybe, but nothing that encourages critical thought about society or power.
So a tiny, globally fluent elite and a mass kept intentionally uninformed.
Exactly. Boulaga saw this not as an accident, but as creating a kind of particularly perverse educational apartheid. Education became a tool to lock in political inequality.
Wow. Educational apartheid.
Yeah, and this ties into what Joseph Kizerbo, the Burkinabe historian, called democracy becoming an empty shell.
An empty shell.
All the outward forms are there, the institutions, the voting, but the essential substance, the ability of citizens to understand, analyze, and influence decisions. That's been systematically hollowed out. The shell looks fine, but inside, it's empty.
It prompts you to look at your own society, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How does access to different types of education correlate with power, with understanding how things really work? Are there subtle tracks being laid?
It's a crucial question anywhere, I think.
So this whole system, this maintained ignorance,
Yeah,
it feeds itself, right? A vicious cycle.
absolutely. It's incredibly difficult to break because it's self-reinforcing. People who are deprived of the tools to understand democracy can't effectively demand a better education system that would give them those tools.
They don't know what they're missing or how to ask for it.
Right, and this reminds me of Amartya Sen's work on development as freedom.
How does that connect?
Sen argued that freedom isn't just about lack of coercion, it's about capability. Education is a fundamental capability. Without it, you lack not just knowledge, but the very ability to claim your other rights effectively.
So lack of education is a denial of freedom itself.
In a very real sense, an uneducated population isn't just uninformed, it's disempowered from advocating for its own interests, which just keeps the cycle going.
And Lisangola sees this playing out in social movements, too.
Yes, and this is quite revealing.
Yeah.
He asks, when people do get discontented, who's actually organizing the protests? What's the driving force?
And his observation is
That popular demonstrations are almost invariably orchestrated by political leaders pursuing their personal interests, not usually spontaneous grassroots movements driven by civic awareness.
so even protests can be manipulated.
Co-opted, certainly. It shows this deep intellectual dependence. Even expressing discontent often needs to be authorized or channeled by figures within the existing power structure.
So the anger gets directed maybe towards a rival faction, but not towards changing the system itself?
Often, yes. The protests that get traction, maybe even some protection, are the ones serving some elite's internal power struggle.
And what about protests focused on fundamental issues, like demanding better education or transparency?
Lisangola says those rare attempts at spontaneous mobilization for truly systemic change are systematically ignored or repressed. Brutally sometimes.
That's cynical. Protect the protests that help shuffle the deck chairs, crush the ones that might actually change the ship's course.
It's a perfect illustration of how ignorance is used as a tool of control. Even popular anger can be weaponized to maintain the status quo, just by directing it away from the root causes.
Makes you really scrutinize any protest or movement, doesn't it? Who's really behind it? Who benefits? Whose voices are being amplified and whose are being silenced? Critical questions.
Crucial questions. And it leads Lisangola to conclude that the solution can't just be tinkering around the edges.
Not just technical fixes.
No. He invokes Hannah Arendt here, her idea of needing a revolution of thought.
A revolution of thought, what does that entail?
A radical shift in how we even conceive of education and democracy. A deep questioning of our basic assumptions about what democracy is and what it requires from us.
So moving beyond just seeing elections as the be-all and end-all.
Exactly. It's no longer sufficient, he argues. True democracy needs a continuous process of civic and political education. Not just school stuff, but lifelong learning and engagement.
Aimed at what? Just knowing facts.
No, much deeper, aimed at allowing citizens to deeply understand the stakes of their choices and the implications of their political decisions. Real, informed participation.
And this education isn't just about institutions and procedures.
Critically, no. It's about developing genuine critical capacity, an awakened political consciousness.
Meaning the ability to see through spin, to
Oh.
resist manipulation.
Precisely. To deconstruct manipulative arguments, to recognize propaganda, to understand when someone is trying to use you for their own agenda. It's about intellectual self-defense in a complex political world.
That's a powerful vision. But it brings us back to that paradox, doesn't it?
The huge central paradox. How do you get a political class that benefits from ignorance to champion the intellectual emancipation of the people they rule?
How do you change a system using the levers controlled by those who want the system to stay the same?
It's the fundamental dilemma. How do you fix the system from within when the system's flaws serve those in power?
And the stakes are incredibly high now, aren't they, with all the global challenges?
Absolutely. Climate change, the digital age, economic shifts, geopolitics. These are complex issues demanding informed citizens everywhere. How can we possibly expect enlightened citizen participation if the basics of democratic understanding are missing?
It makes the need for this educational shift even more urgent.
Immensely urgent. Lisa Angola closes by invoking Nelson Mandela. Education is the most powerful weapon.
You can use to change the world. A classic.
But Lisa Angola adds that critical qualifier. This weapon must be accessible to all and oriented toward emancipation rather than domination.
So education as liberation, not control.
Exactly. An instrument of collective liberation, not a tool to maintain privilege. It's a call to fundamentally reimagine what education is for.
Which brings it back to us listening, reflecting on our own education, our society. How well are we really fostering critical thinking? Or do we sometimes settle for easy answers, maybe discourage questioning?
Yeah,
It's a challenge for all of us.
it really is. So if we boil down this deep dive into Lisa Angola's work, the core takeaway is this. The link between education and democracy isn't just theoretical. It's vital. The African experience he analyzes shows a fundamental truth. Without an educated populace, one that can truly understand and engage, democracy risks being just that empty facade.
Right, so the real challenge isn't just holding elections, it's creating the conditions, the educational foundation, for people to participate in a truly meaningful, critical way, building that informed engagement.
And that transformation, that revolution of thought, needs more than just money or new laws. It needs a fundamental shift in how we think about citizenship itself. It's more than just voting. Which leads to a final question for you, listening. Beyond the ballot box, what can we actually do? In our own lives, our communities, how can we foster this intellectual and civic revolution, even in small ways? Through how we learn, how we talk, how we question.
Because it's only through that kind of deeper change, that educational and intellectual shift, that we can hope for democracy to be more than just a word, for the power of the people to become a genuine living reality for everyone. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.